So, James, we are now live, and people in the chat say sound is good. So, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Okay, so thanks for having me, Tom. I hope that I got the name right because I've been wanting to remember the name. So thank you for having me. So yeah, my name is James, and I'm based in South Africa. For those that may not know, it's still a country in Africa. And as I've already mentioned, I don't know if those that are still just coming into the life, I'm doing my master's in medicine, specializing in vaccinology. So I get a lot of questions of, do you trust the vaccines and all kind of stuff? So that's the whole topic altogether. So I'm a YouTuber as well, but this is more like a part-time thing where my channel is called Roundtable Apologetics, and I started pretty recently, basically last year, I think last year or towards the beginning of the actually last year, that's when I started. And the very purpose of my channel was to actually have conversations both at a very philosophical level, but I'm still a baby at this, and also at a very, very basic level, because more often than not, at least from my culture and background, we've perceived philosophy as that abstract language that only a specific set group of people speak, and the rest of us ought to just stick in the basic way of understanding things. So I'm trying to bridge that gap between philosophy, most especially Christian philosophy, and the layman's terms, or rather theology within the context of the church. So I'm also trying to present the thoughtful perspective of Christianity, because I've also grown up in a context where majority of the beliefs was sort of just taught to me, and I never really got the time to actually very well critically assess this belief system. So it's only through what's it called, assessing some of these thought processes, some of these belief systems, and that's how I got to the understanding that maybe it's actually better to critically assess all these belief systems, both from the Christian perspective as well as those that are presented by the non-believers, and then see maybe at the end of the day we can have a belief system that is genuine and authentic. So that's I'm Christians actually. I'm actually Christian, so I believe in God, and I'm specifically a Christian theist, and not I don't subscribe to any other religion, at least not thus far. So that's briefly about me.
Cool. I'm an
Yeah.
atheist, by which I mean I believe that there's no evidence of a God. I think everything in the universe is best explained by naturalism, the natural forces that are unguided by any kind of a mind. Could you tell me some of the reasons you think there are for belief in a God? And I'll tell you my thoughts on those and hear your thoughts on my position.
Okay, so essentially from my perspective, I'd love to think that my Christian belief, rather position, is to a certain extent guided by a level of reason. So I do believe that or the basic part of it is that the belief system, alongside with analysis maybe from the scientific community and certain arguments that are presented both by the scientific and the atheist community, it seems that they both can work concurrently to support the belief system, which is the Christian faith. So maybe, of course, there's a lot of argumentation. I'm going to admit that I'm not very, very philosophically sound on these arguments, but there are certain argumentations that present themselves to be in favor of the Christian, or rather theistic worldview. And maybe we can look into the what's it called, the arguments from contingency. We can look at the arguments, rather the cosmological arguments. I'm just more familiar with the Kalam cosmological argumentation as opposed to other cosmological argumentations. Maybe we can look into talk about some of the analysis made on maybe the fine-tuning arguments and within in support of the Christian worldview. I mean, we can talk about even the moral argumentations. Probably you've had conversations with other theists about these arguments, but maybe these are some of the arguments, at least from my perspective, that I tend to look at and see that they create a cumulative case for Christianity. I've come across a few of the arguments from the atheistic perspective, maybe the divine hiddenness argument, and what's it called, the problem of evil, logical and evidential. And those are the things that I'm still trying to assess and see. But so far, currently, I'm more inclined to believe the possibility or the probability of there being a God, as opposed to there not being a God, based on the argumentation philosophically that I've encountered, but also I also wouldn't undermine the experiences that I've had personally as a Christian, because those, to a certain extent, also do contribute to my belief system. Because in as much as you can argue that personal experience is not that reliable in the context of us understanding what is objectively true, that on a personal level does contribute to a certain level of belief in what I hold to be true, which is the Christian worldview. So there's a level of experience and there's a level of conviction and all that kind of stuff. That's briefly put.
Okay, so the first two you mentioned were the contingency argument and the cosmological arguments. Those are about
Yeah.
the same. Why do you think either of
Okay.
those or both of those indicate a god as opposed to just an unknown natural force?
So I do believe that I feel like if we were to argue, maybe specifically looking at the Kalam cosmological argument, and we are to make the premise that every single thing that began, or rather, the universe began to exist, and everything that begins to exist has a cause. And if we were to argue that the universe entails everything, that's including energy, time, space, and matter, that would rather logically eliminate any naturalistic explanation thus far. So if we were to argue that everything began, I mean, like the time, space, and matter and energy all began to exist at some particular point in time, that would necessarily exclude and naturalistic explanations, because naturalistic explanations are rather specific to space, time, energy, and matter, so to speak, right? So
Why do
anything outside
you
of that.
why would you think that? Because no one in science thinks that. Like in the consensus in physics is that space and time are emergent from more fundamental physical things. So nobody who is a naturalist thinks that all natural things are in space, time, and matter. That seems to be something that theists kind of like put onto naturalists that we never actually accepted.
But I think then the naturalists would have to prove if there are anything other than space, time, matter, and energy that exists or that could possibly exist prior to that. Then that then is not it's a burden not on the theist to prove that they ought to be. I mean, the theist can only argue that outside of time, space, and matter, and energy as well, there ought to be something spaceless, timeless, matterless, and what's it called? Not confined to the constraints of energy as we understand it. And maybe that could potentially bring about these particular components, right? So then it's upon the naturalists to prove that there could potentially be something other than what we currently are aware of, to then suggest that that could potentially be the result of these particular things existing there.
So, what would be the difference between the naturalist and the theist here? So, we both agree that there's something before time, space, and matter. You say it's supernatural, I say it's natural, but both of them have zero evidence right now. So, why would you think that the naturalist holds the burden of proof and the theist doesn't?
I would propose that given the tendency in which most things, or let me call it most components that are very complexly arranged within the world that we find ourselves in. So I'm going to make more like an inductive argument, right? If you look at most of the things that seemingly are very well organized or very well arranged or present an intellectual arrangement within and of themselves, they seem to have a certain component of a mind or something that, let me just say, maybe if you look at a computer, for example, right, we can't necessarily say that a computer, what's it called, came about by purely a natural process, right? There could be a natural explanation for how the computer came about, right? But at the end of at the back of it, there is an understanding that there's potentially a mind that put together all these components within the natural world that then brought forth this particular computer for it to function the way it certainly or necessarily functions. So maybe I would presume rather follow through that if the universe happens to perform or function in a way that is, which seems to be in a, I think at least with a level of purpose or soundness, or maybe to arise into those of us creatures that have like a sound mind or a conscience, then there is possibility, rather there is a possibility of a mind being behind it or coming to place, as opposed to it being a random process. And this is me jumping on a lot of things, but that's in an abstract format. That's how I would understand it.
Yeah, that seems like the fine-tuning argument, but that goes to a different argument. So it seems like just the cosmological argument that you presented isn't evidence. It's only
Mm.
if the fine-tuning argument works, then the cosmological argument might indicate a God. But it seems like the cosmological argument on its own doesn't indicate a God at all. Just because you need to indicate a God, you need this fine-tuning argument. You need a completely separate argument to make this
Okay,
argument work.
yeah, but I think at the end of the day, sorry, no, I'm not saying at the end of the day to just close the case. I'm proposing that whilst assessing the possibility of the existence of God, I would rather propose that it's more or less based on a cumulative case of majority of the arguments that are presented, as opposed to one case. So I don't necessarily argue that one case or one argument is going to exclusively prove the existence of God. For all you know, all it could prove is an object or a being or a substance that's just timeless, spaceless, and matterless. Then it calls for other arguments that then present a different facet of that particular thing, which then maybe can lead to the conclusion being God. And for all you know, what we refer to as God from our human perspective could simply be like a super powerful naturalistic mechanism that works, that is timeless, that is spaceless, that is matterless, that doesn't necessarily is not necessarily bound to the laws of this particular constraint of our universe, right? And then that brought forth the universe, right? So at the end of the day, we're simply ascribing a certain abstract thing that we don't understand as maybe God, right? So, but at the end of the day, if it pertains to our understanding of what or who God is, maybe from the Christian worldview, we understand that there is qualities of omnipotence, there's qualities of timelessness, there's qualities of um being all what's it called, omniscient and all that kind of stuff. So maybe when you look at those qualities and you parallel them to this particular abstract thing, then it's much more easier to make the conclusion that this particular thing that we're describing from the purely naturalistic perspective is more equivalent to what the Christians define as God, as opposed to purely a random natural process.
Well, so the first thing you said was that you're arguing for a cumulative case, which is fine, but you need at least one of the arguments that indicates a God versus a non-God. So, like, if none of the arguments indicate God more so than a non-God, then the cumulative case is zero. So you need at least one argument that indicates God more than non-God. And it seems like the cosmological argument doesn't do that. So the cosmological argument doesn't count as evidence for God at all. It just seems like nothing. It seems exactly like a zero because it works for both. There could be everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. The universe has a cause, but that cause could just be a quantum field. So it doesn't need to be a God. So the cosmological argument, because it works for both a God and a non-God equally, is exactly zero evidence for a God. It seems like, unless there's something in the cosmological argument that would indicate God over non-God, and that when I asked for that, you brought up the teleological argument. That's a different argument. So we can go into the teleological argument next, but just using the cosmological argument, is there anything in just the cosmological argument that gives us a reason to think it's a God versus a not God?
I think what we need to maybe define is what we mean by the universe, right? Because if we were to argue that the universe consists of all, would you propose that quantum, whether what you call maybe a quantum field, doesn't necessarily subscribe to the definition of what matter or energy or space is, or could we?
Yes. So quantum fields exist outside of matter, energy, and space. They exist outside of our universe. So our universe
So
had
I
a
think no,
beginning at
no,
the, well, just to go into the physics a little bit,
okay.
our universe had a beginning at the Big Bang. Our universe is a space-time manifold. It's a field of space-time. And that had a beginning, but outside of that beginning was quantum fields. And the consensus in physics, the consensus among the experts in physics is that space and time are emergent from these quantum fields, the vector space or something along those
So
lines.
now it seems like even when you're creating that description, there is still a level, because how do you then explain a quantum field without energy? If you are to argue that energy also began at the
Well,
maybe
no,
birth of what we understand as the universe?
Well, energy didn't begin. There was energy cannot be created or destroyed. So there's no beginning to energy.
Okay. So now that's when we then suggest the proposal is that the beginning of the universe infers the beginning of energy, space, time, matter, and all that exists as it pertains to our understanding of what the universe is, right? So if we were to then argue that what's it called? That even, and this is I don't know if this is could possibly work, but if we were to argue that even that conception of energy, if it doesn't have a beginning, maybe has a source in and of itself, right? We are then going to have to argue maybe that which we perceive of as energy, all right? What kind of qualities does it have, right? Can they maybe can a quantum field end up creating a very sophisticated universe that we have currently? Can a quantum field,
Well,
what's it
just to
called?
clarify, in physics, energy wasn't created. It cannot be created and cannot be destroyed. So the Big Bang isn't the
Mhm.
creation of energy. Energy
No, no, no.
cannot.
I'm not assuming. I'm not suggesting that the Big Bang is the creation of energy, right? I'm assuming that if the composition of the universe consists of energy, right, energy, space, time, and matter, and whatever we have that, right, then we can, and we have the, let me call it. It could potentially be a contradiction. We have a contradiction that maybe the universe began to exist, right? Then we ought to have a conception of where if energy, because our understanding of the energy, rather our understanding of the non-beginningness of energy within the physics realm is also based on the physics laws that we currently understand, right?
Sure.
Or the laws of physics that we currently understand, right? So if we were to argue that maybe or can we potentially logically argue that an all-powerful being can work outside of the laws of physics? Can we potentially argue
Sure.
that? So if we
Sure.
can potentially argue that the being created all of this energy, matter, space, and time brought forth an energy, right, from wherever, we're not necessarily going to assume where because we can't potentially know. And by the constraints of our laws, maybe set these laws that we are trying to define about our universe. And can that potentially be an explanation in and of itself?
Well, you can assert it, but to me, it seems like we have, if we say there's a beginning to the universe we see, and all of the physics and all of the evidence we have says energy never was created. And you have a different theory that doesn't seem to have any evidence. It's just that God created energy, which would violate the first law of thermodynamics, which says energy cannot be created or destroyed. It seems like the better hypothesis here is the one that the scientists say, because they're saying there's no violation of the first law of thermodynamics. And so it's consistent with all of the known laws of physics, whereas yours is a violation of the known laws of physics and doesn't have any evidence. So it seems like the better explanation here is the physics one, not the God one. Because I can just say there's a magical leprechaun that created all space, time, and energy or whatever, but it's just an assertion. I've just made it up. Unless there's some independent evidence to support that, the fact that I can imagine it wouldn't actually be evidence. So it seems like um, all you've provided is that you can imagine God created space, time, and energy, and so you think he's a thing that you can assert as an explanation of the cosmological argument, but you haven't provided us a reason to think it is the explanation, because there could just be a naturalistic one, just like quantum fields. Quantum fields can explain the creation of our universe. They don't violate the first law of thermodynamics. Energy has always existed. That seems to be a better explanation here than yours,
Uh,
which violates the first law of
I don't
thermodynamics.
think sorry, I don't think I've come across a sophisticated physics that asserts that quantum physics is a, should I say, could be a very good explanation of the beginning of our universe. Maybe you could clarify on how they actually come to that, how you come to that conclusion.
Sure. So there's the consensus view in physics is called emergent space-time. You could just Google emergent space-time, and it's the view that space and time are not fundamental, and they came about from more fundamental things, and those more fundamental things are a kind of quantum field. And the way we came to this conclusion is by combining two other things that we've demonstrated. The Casimir effect. The Casimir effect has been demonstrated in a lab which demonstrates that virtual particles are real. And the second thing is Goose early universe inflation. Goose early universe inflation was confirmed by measurements of the cosmic microwave background radiation. So both of these things, when you put these two independent things together, you get multiverse theory, essentially, is one of the possibilities. So we look
Yeah,
at...
great. Yeah. You go ahead. Sorry,
Well,
I was
yeah.
listening. Go ahead.
So this model is a combination of principles, particles, and laws that have been confirmed to exist with empirical verified tests. Whereas your model
Yeah.
seems to be not, none of the properties of your model seem to be confirmed by any empirical tests. So even though we haven't proven the multiverse, we obviously can't see other universes. We can see the parts of the theory. So all of the parts of the theory, virtual particles and early universe inflation, both of the parts have been demonstrated. And if we combine those two parts, we get the multiverse. Whereas yours has a bunch of parts and none of the parts have been demonstrated. And so it seems like this theory is a better theory because the parts haven't been demonstrated in the theory, whereas yours, the parts haven't been demonstrated. Thank you for the super chat, Kennedy. Appreciate it.
Okay, so I think at the end of the day, sorry, I like using the term at the end of the day, but I think I feel like no, I don't feel like. I think when it comes to the inflation model that you've spoken about it, even I think I've forgotten whether it's Vilenkin or one of the physicists that spoke about that. At the end of the day, even Vilenkin proves that that there is still, even with the inflation model, the question of the beginning, right? We see that even within the context of the inflation theory that gives rise to the possibility of a multiverse theory, right? There is still the idea that there is a beginning at the end of the day. So maybe we ought to then argue whether there is a beginning or no beginning of
Well, I
whatever the
granted
universe
there's a
that we find
beginning.
ourselves
Remember,
in.
so I granted there's a beginning. I just said the beginning is from the quantum fields. So I'm not arguing for an infinite regression here. I'm just saying there's a beginning, which is a quantum field.
So then are you suggesting that the quantum fields have eternally existed to bring about the beginning of this particular universe or multiverse?
Well, they existed outside of space-time. So if that's what you mean by eternally, sure.
Okay, so if we're to talk about even, let's say, the multiverse, are we suggesting that, of course, if you look at maybe the multiverse theory within the context of inflation, right, we are seeing portions of maybe space and time beginning within this particular inflatory, how do I call it? This within, if you look at the inflation model, or maybe if I misrepresent it, please correct me. But if we were to look at this inflation model, right, and there is the proposition of a multiversal theory, we see that even the universes that are beginning within this particular inflated thing have their own concept of space and time. So are we then suggesting there is various points within which space and times, spaces and times are being birthed? Are we suggesting there is one idea of space and time being birthed by the inflation model, where these particular multiversal um, stretches of space then present themselves? Is that what you're suggesting?
Uh, Both, essentially. So each universe can have its own space-time independent of the global space-time of the multiverse. And all of the space-times came about from a quantum field which existed outside of all of the space-times. So it created the
Mm.
one that's throughout all the multiverse and all of the ones that exist in the multiverse.
Okay, so that's good. So now with regards to what's it called? Us still arguing that there is a beginning, right? And there not being an eternal existence, we can maybe go to the second phase of maybe, I think it's the Kalam cosmological argument. So if we were to argue that maybe the quantum field, for some weird reason, is so we have two explanations. There is the quantum field possible explanation, and we have the theory of a God, right? And the next level of the Kalam cosmological argument then speaks about the personhood of this particular initiator of all of this creation that we're speaking about, right? Because if the prior event that brought about the beginning of these particular substances that we're talking about was impersonal, then the question is, why did it not bring things into existence eternally? Because if there is an eternal existence of an impersonal initiator of all of this that we're speaking about, then the things that it brought forth could have been brought back, rather, let's say they could have also existed eternally, right? Unless maybe you're proposing that at some particular before time, this quantum field didn't create anything until it created something that we're now experiencing.
Well, the quantum field exists outside of space-time, so
Yeah.
it can do anything essentially that God can do. Like like you imagine God makes a decision to create the universe or something.
Mm,
A
mm,
quantum
mm, mm.
field can have a collapse, and the collapse can happen at an infinite amount of times. So, like, there's a thing in physics where the decay rate of uranium is known at a rate, but it can be at any random interval in the rate. So it's completely random. It can decay at 1 second, 2 seconds, 47 seconds, and it just picks. The quantum field picks the time at which it decays because of quantum randomness. So because of quantum randomness, the time at which the universe began is the time the quantum field picked. It doesn't need a consciousness for this. That's just how quantum fields work. So because of the randomness interval, there could be an infinite amount of times before when it picked, because like if it picks 47, there's infinitely many numbers before 47. You just keep counting backwards. But it picked 47. And so because quantum fields can collapse at particular times in an infinite range, that's why the universe began to exist when it did and not infinitely before when it did.
Okay, so I think now what you're proposing is that given that the quantum field can rather do whatever it does at a random state, right? I feel like this particular explanation is purely on the basis of what's it called? The explanation of what example did you give? Uranium?
Uranium decay, so there's many different
Uranium
things.
decay, yeah. So I feel like most of this particular the explanation of how a quantum field could potentially or possibly work outside of space and time is on the basis of how the quantum field works within time space. So then how do you argue that that could be the case in the context of outside of space and time? And actually, when you're talking about the quantum how actually quantum mechanics works, right? How do you come to the understanding of that outside of space and time if you've never actually maybe made that observation?
Because you can
Aren't you then
solve the
appealing to
equations.
speculation? Okay.
No, you make testable predictions. So the way they came to this conclusion was they looked at the equations for general and special relativity, and they showed that they can take out, because time is the lambda in the equation, so you can take the lambda out
Okay.
of the equations and solve the equations. That means time isn't necessary to solve the equations to have some kind of interactions. You can have interactions without time. And they said, well, if this is the case, what would we expect to see? And then they started to make predictions. They said, well, if this is the case and time is not fundamental to these equations, then there's going to be some kind of feature to the world that's going to look very funny. The things like they discovered were entanglement, particle duality, and they did these experiments called the delayed quantum eraser. Said, well, if it works outside of time, then we're going to see this very silly thing where they can collapse at one point and then go back in time and affect the spin of the other one because they're outside of time, and that's what they see. In the delayed quantum eraser, they have two entangled particles that go in different directions. One hits a barrier before the other one, but the second one is the one that's measured. And what it causes is it seems like it goes back in time and affects the first one, essentially. So we can show with empirical demonstration that the predictions made by this model, that if quantum fields exist outside of space-time, here's what we will see. We do the experiments and we see the results. And so we have good reason to believe that space and time are emergent from more fundamental things that are outside of space-time.
Okay, so now if let's give that space and time are emerging from those what's it called? More fundamental things, right? I still don't see how this rules out the explanation of God,
It
right?
doesn't. It
Because
doesn't.
we
It
could we
doesn't.
could still
It doesn't. You're right.
okay,
It doesn't
okay,
rule out God, but it gives evidence
okay.
for the natural model. So the
I think
natural model
yeah.
makes predictions, which has evidence, whereas your model doesn't have any evidence. So like the natural
I
model
think
doesn't rule out magical leprechauns either, but there's no evidence for magical leprechauns where there is evidence for the natural model. That's why the natural model is a better one.
I think it's also let's maybe look at the example of a boiling kettle. If, for example, I chose or decided to put a kettle on the fire, there is very, very plausible explanations as to how the water begins to boil. However, there's no evidence as to the reasons that I could potentially have put that kettle onto the fire, right? There is no explanation as to how the kettle actually moved from a place without maybe a heat point of hit to the place where it has hit or something like that. So at the end of the day, I think what we're left with is a natural explanation of a certain mechanism, but we don't necessarily have what's it called? We don't necessarily have what could have potentially led to that. right? So then we have two theories. We have a theory that explains how water boils, and maybe we don't necessarily have access to the reasons as to why the water is boiling in the first place. So the natural, rather, the scientific explanation I would propose is simply how we then come to understand how maybe the world works, right? But that in and of itself ought not to eliminate the possibility of maybe what led to the world working in that particular way, right? So if we were to still argue, let's give that maybe space and time is emergent from the quantum influx, or whatever explanation there could be, whatever other explanation they could be, right? That in of itself doesn't actually bring forth, doesn't eradicate, as I mean, you've already mentioned, or rather agreed, that doesn't necessarily eradicate the idea of there being a personal being or object or substance that brings forth, or maybe brings forth a universe from the quantum field. All we are seeing is we're arguing that the quantum field brings forth the universe, or rather, that's the mechanism by which the universe comes forth. But we're not necessarily eradicating or eliminating that could also be a way via which God actually brings forth the universe. So at the end of the day, if I'm to contrast that idea of me believing that all this happened just at random, as opposed to there being a possible explanation for why maybe the universe works in that particular way, I'd rather buy into the possibility of there being an explanation as to why maybe the universe works in that particular way, and then brought forth certain certain attributes that maybe we've subscribed as time, space, and matter that we're currently seeing now. So at the end of the day, if we have two theories of the emergence or the beginning of the universe, and they both are equally powerfully as explanatory, then it seems to me that there is no favoring one over the other. And if there is no one favoring over the other, it goes back to a matter of preference, isn't it?
Sure, but I don't think those are equal. So to me, that seemed like a God of the gaps argument. So like science makes progress, makes testable predictions which are confirmed, whereas the God hypothesis doesn't make. It's just well, science hasn't gotten to this next step yet. We're going to say God is in this next step, and then science solves that problem, and then like, oh, well, God wasn't there. We're just going to put him back a step. The problem with that kind of thinking is that there's not just two theories there. There's infinitely many. There's infinitely many theories science doesn't disprove. Like maybe it's magic leprechauns or magic unicorns or ectoplasm or ghosts or the dharma from other religions. There's infinitely many things that could have caused the origin of the universe, but none of those have evidence. So the fact that science has shown that space and time is emergent shows that that model is the closest to truth. It is the most reasonable to believe because it's the one that's making progress and being able to tell us about the universe before we know it. So it can make predictions that are correct that we will discover in the future, whereas none of the other ones do. There's infinitely many other ones: God, leprechauns, fairies, pixies. They all could be true. Science hasn't disproven them, but none of them have made progress, which means of all of the possible theories to explain the Big Bang, the best theory is the one that has made progress, testable predictions, the science. And all of the other ones are on equal footing. So the leprechauns and God and fairies are all on equal footing, whereas science is better than all of those because it's made progress, making predictions.
I think what I'm trying to propose is not that there is some level of what's it called, what's it called, how to call it. I'm not proposing a conflict between science and God, right? I think my analysis, or rather argument, is that God could potentially, possibly have used the mechanism of science, that which you explained through the scientific method, to bring forth the universe, right? So I'm not necessarily arguing a God of the gaps that it's God until science explains it. My argument is that that explanation that is given by God could possibly have been used by God to bring forth the universe. So even in the whole, I could still say God allowed for the mechanism by which a man and a woman come together and conceive of another offspring, right? Or conceive of that offspring. In that regard, I'm simply arguing that there is an explanation, or there is an understanding of how conception occurs. And there is a scientific explanation, but that doesn't necessarily draw God out of the equation, because my argument is that God put that particular mechanism to work that particular way, maybe for a particular cause or for a particular purpose. And that's why maybe we distinguish between a purposeless, a meaningless, a random universe, as opposed to a universe that has a set of purpose or a certain concept of purpose and meaning ascribed to it, right? So we both have an explanation of how the universe came forth, right? And my argument is that that understanding as brought forth by the scientific method is simply a way to show how things were done, maybe by an all-powerful and all-knowing God. And maybe your analysis is that that explanation that science is giving is purely expressive of a random natural process that ought to occur if the natural world is all that there is, right? So now we both have explanations, and my argument is that I don't believe that that explanation that the scientific method is giving is all that there is, right? My argument is that there is a, let me call it, just lack of a better word, a hand behind the processes that the scientific method is trying to explain. And then your argument is that there's not hand at all. It's simply something that's happening at random. I would propose that's where the distinction is. So the distinction is not science versus God. The distinction is what science is explaining. Is it purely all there is, or could there be a hand behind it?
Right, but I think that's literally just the God of the Gaps argument. And let me explain to you why. Imagine
Okay.
that we see a cup fall over. There's like a table, we see a cup fall over, and we want to explain what caused the cup to fall over. I think it's just random natural processes, and somebody else thinks it's a magical leprechaun. Now, I'm thinking it's natural processes, and I say, well, if it's natural processes, we can discover that it was actually the wind, because we'll find leaves near the table or whatever. And we look and there's leaves. So it's like, okay, that's good evidence of wind. And he says, well, no. You see, maybe the leprechauns caused the wind. That's why we see the leaves in the cup fall over. So I haven't disproven his theory that it's the leprechauns, even though mine has told us about the area and has given us a prediction about the leaves, and we've demonstrated it was the wind that knocked over the cup. He could just say, oh, no, but it's fine because the leprechauns, they caused the wind. And I'm like, no, I think what caused the wind was a natural process. And we can demonstrate that because I think wind is caused by pressure differentials in the atmosphere. And we can test the pressure differentials in the atmosphere. Like, yep, wind is caused by pressure differentials in the atmosphere, not leprechauns. And the leprechaun guy could be like, oh, no, wait, but those pressure differentials, those could be caused by leprechauns. So even though leprechauns didn't cause the cup to fall over and they didn't cause the wind, they caused the pressure differentials that caused the wind, that caused the leaves. And so every different thing I could explain, I could then explain the pressure differentials, and I could explain the temperature difference in particles in the atmosphere, which is caused by rotation of the Earth and heating of the sun. I can continue to go back infinitely, and he can continue to say, well, even though that wasn't caused by the leprechauns, the thing before it was. And you can just say that infinitely. You can just keep
No, I
saying,
think, yeah. So I think where I would distinguish myself from the goals of the gap analysis is not necessarily to say that we're pushing back the cause of something as far as science knows, because that would be the God of the gaps argumentation, right? My analysis is that, using the very example that you gave, is that the mechanism, let's assume that the wind actually caused the cup to fall down, right? The mechanism by which what's it called, the wind actually has the pressure to push the cup over, right? That mechanism was potentially, in this case, we're using the leprechaun. Maybe that mechanism in this case was put forth in that particular way by the leprechaun, right? At the end of the day, we're not suggesting, or rather, the analysis is not that the leprechaun literally pushed the cup over. The analysis is that whatever mechanism by which the cup fell, to whatever degree that you want to explain it scientifically, that mechanism was made possible by a certain, if what we're calling intelligible leprechaun, right? So we're not arguing that what's it called, the leprechaun caused this to be, in a sense. We're arguing that the leprechaun set forth a mechanism that then can be explained through the scientific method. I think that's my argumentation. Right from when maybe gravity, maybe the wind pushes the cup, gravity pulls the cup to the ground, the cup breaks because of whatever energy distribution within the cup. All those mechanisms that bring forth the cup from a certain point, a certain position to fall onto the ground, all those mechanisms could have been set forth by a certain intelligible being, right? For whatever reason, we do not know. Similarly, just like maybe initially when I made the example of the boiling kettle, right? At the end of the day, maybe you can explain how mitochondria generates energy within my body, and maybe how that interacts with my brain thinking about me wanting a cup of coffee, and then me putting the kettle on the stove and me. So all those mechanisms, right, work with me to put the kettle onto the stove for me to boil the tea that I want to drink because I'm hungry, right? But at the end of the day, the reason, let me say, the reason behind why I'm putting the kettle onto the stove is because I'm hungry. But the process by which I put the kettle on the stove can simply be explained scientifically. So at the end of the day, I'm not necessarily pushing the cause of why the kettle is on the stove. I'm simply suggesting that maybe there is an explanation alongside the scientific explanation that brings forth the water to boil on top of a stove. So
Right. So I
I don't know if you
understand.
get
I
the difference.
understand your argument, but your argument is
Yeah.
literally the God of the Gaps fallacy. We can prove that that argument is bad. It's a bad argument. Thank you for the super chat, native atheist. I appreciate it. And I'm trying to explain to you why we can prove this is bad. Now, if I say, what caused the cup to fall over, and you say leprechauns, and I say, no, it's not leprechauns, it's the wind. And we prove it's the wind. We demonstrate it's the wind. 100% certainty we know it was the wind. And you say, oh, well, actually, the leprechaun caused the wind. And I'm like, no, it wasn't the leprechaun that caused the wind. It was the pressure differentials. And we demonstrate it's the pressure differentials. And then the guy could say, no, but the pressure differentials, those were caused by the leprechaun. You can always add on. You can always say exactly what you said. Even though we've demonstrated everything there is to demonstrate right there, well, maybe there's some other thing we haven't demonstrated yet. But the problem with this is everyone can say that. There could literally just be another guy that could come up and say, it's not a leprechaun, it's a unicorn. And another guy that could come up and say, it's not a unicorn or a leprechaun, it's a ghost. A ghost knocked the cup over. There are infinitely many people who could always come on and say, well, there's one more thing that could explain that. Even though we know that the wind knocked over the cup, what explains that is this other thing that I've asserted that has no evidence yet. Anybody could say that. There's infinitely many of those. But the only hypothesis that has evidence right now is the natural forces. That's the only one that said, if my theory is true, here's something we can expect to see, and then it sees it. That's evidence. That's real evidence that whoever is making those predictions can tell you the future because they know what's going on in the world. And so if the naturalistic hypothesis can be tell you the future, and none of the others can. None of the others have ever been able to tell you the future. All they can do is say, well, maybe that stuff science is discovering, well, we can explain that by leprechauns or fairies or ghosts and just insert one of the hypotheses. None of those are supported. None of those are good because they haven't made predictions. They have no evidence. But the one that does have evidence is the one that predicted all of those things in the first place. And so if we're comparing the two models here, God or naturalistic hypotheses, because the naturalistic hypothesis was able to make the predictions to explain all of this stuff, the quantum fields, the emergent space-time, everything in physics, and was successful at this, the fact that you can say, well, maybe that was explained by God, or maybe that was explained by leprechauns, or maybe that was explained by Dharma, none of those are supported. Those are all bad hypotheses because they weren't able to tell us anything about the future that it got right, whereas the scientific one did that. So even though you're right, you can always say, well, maybe that thing we discovered was explained by something else we haven't discovered yet. That isn't good evidence because anybody can say that.
I think when I continue to look at the analysis that we're actually making right now, I feel like what distinguishes maybe the atheist from the theist is not necessarily whether they do agree or disagree with the naturalistic method of, or rather what I would call this scientific method of understanding the world, right? Because at the end of the day, on both sides of the arguments, we can still acknowledge that the scientific methods makes us understand how the world works, at least from purely physical. It gives us, which word should I use? It gives us, due to lack of a better word, I'm going to put it as simple as this. The scientific method is the process by which the world works, right? So now what necessarily, we both do agree that via the scientific methods, we can understand how the world works or maybe how the world came to be. But where we disagree between the theist and the atheist is to argue whether they be a reason or explanation behind how the world works, as opposed to there no being reason or explanation behind how the world works, right? It's like suggesting that I could still use, because I still would beg to defer that I'm appealing to the God of the Gaps fallacy. I would still use the kettle example where at the end of the day, there is reason behind why I'm putting the kettle on the stove, right?
Well,
And
let
that
me try to
reason
explain it in a
is
different way for 1
irrespective.
sec.
Yeah.
So imagine we see a dice on the table, like a 6-sided dice, and it's on a 3. Now, it's possible somebody deliberately put the dice there. It's like, I really like the number 3. I'm going to put it on a 3. It's possible it just like was blown by the wind and just happened to fall on a 3. Or it's possible the dice is weighted. Like there's a weight in the dice, so no matter who throws it, it's always going to land 3 because the weight forces it to land 3. It's a cheater's dice. Now, you could always say, no matter what number we see, well, maybe somebody put it there. There was some guy who really liked the number 3 and he put it there. But if I say, no, it was the wind, and I say I can show it was the wind because here's all the evidence of the wind, that's a better explanation. It's a better way to explain the data. You could always say, well, I think someone has some intent behind this number 3 on the dice. But you'd be wrong. Like it was just random. It just randomly happened because the winds knocked the dice over and it landed 3. Now, could you say, well, maybe the wind had an intent by it? Maybe the guy intended the wind to knock it over to the 3? Sure, you can always say that, but it's a bad explanation. So simply saying that, well, there could be an intent behind it isn't evidence. It's evidence of nothing. You can't say, well, science explained the 3, but there could be this other thing, because that's not evidence. You haven't shown the other thing is real. You would still need evidence the other thing is real, not just simply say, well, this other thing could exist that could explain the science. That's not evidence. That's a god of the gaps. So in order for your argument to be supported, you would need some evidence that this thing happened, not just that it could be there, but that it actually is there. And simply saying that it could explain the data doesn't do that.
Okay, so great. I do understand where you're coming from, and I do understand the explanation that you're trying to present, right? What I can say is that maybe we're missing what I'm trying to say in this particular case, right? Because at the end of the day, if you're to look at maybe if I'm to argue that there is reason for why the person put the 3 there or not, or why the person rolled the die to a number 3 or not, right? There is no scientific way of measuring the reason behind that particular outcome, right?
But
So
yeah,
if you are to make, okay, so let's assume that someone actually rolled the dice, right? Let's assume someone actually rolled the dice without a method of assessing that someone could potentially have rolled the dice. You're only going to end up with a naturalistic explanation of how the die could have rolled to that particular value that he rolled onto, right? Maybe in this particular case, let's even assume there was no wind, right? Or that you're going to give an explanation as to how the die could have potentially rolled from a certain position to another position. Maybe you're going to appeal to the forces of nature, maybe the force of gravity, because maybe at some point in time it was at an elevated space to another elevated space, the forces of gravity, right? But my argument is that in the context where the person rolls the dice, right, whether the person rolled the dice or not, there's a force of gravity that's going to act on the die, right, for it to end up in that particular position that it ended up. So you using maybe the force of gravity as the explanation for why the die rolled from a certain point of elevation to a certain point of to a certain level doesn't necessarily eradicate there being someone rolling the die and also it appealing, or rather being affected by the forces of gravity for it to end up in the position that it ended up at. So maybe where the distinction that I'm trying to draw is that there is there is an explanation for how the die could have possibly ended up in that particular way, right? And that explanation could also complement the action of an intelligible being performing that particular action, right?
Right. I understand that argument. It's still wrong, though. I can prove that argument wrong. Let me try a different way. So let's say I am the only person that exists in the universe. There are no other people that we've ever seen. And there's a dice on the table, and it rolled 3. It's very windy outside. And so we can say it was caused by the wind. Now you could say, well, maybe there's just another person that has 0 evidence. We've never seen another person. Maybe the other person did it. But I can say there's no evidence of another person. We've literally never seen another person anywhere in the universe. It's just you and me. It's just us. We're the only people that we've ever seen in the universe. And we see a dice on the table with a 3. We know there's a lot of wind. The wind could explain the dice on the table. But you say, but it could be another invisible person we've never seen. That's a terrible argument because there's no evidence of that person existing. Saying it could be there isn't evidence. So simply saying it could be God, if you don't actually provide evidence, isn't anything. It's nothing. It's just saying there could be another thing that we have literally no evidence for, like leprechauns. It could be a leprechaun that did it. It's not a good argument. You need evidence in order to support that there is the thing there, not simply say, well, there could be a thing there. Does that make
Mm.
sense?
But that makes sense. But what if that which explains the die rolling to a three doesn't have a form of what's it called? Doesn't have a method via which you can prove that to be the case. What I'm talking about is, remember at the end of the day, when we're making the kettle analogy, when we're making the die analogy, maybe there is a reason for why the person rolled a three. Let's assume maybe that reason is whatever the case may be, the die was duped to roll at three, right? And this particular person has a reason to roll a three, maybe to win a particular gambling game, right? The scientific method won't necessarily prove, or rather, won't have a method by which to prove that there is a reason, or the reason for the rolling of the die made it to roll the die to a
Wait,
three. I
science
think
can
what
do
I'm
that.
drawing to,
Wait, science can
yes,
easily do
no,
that. So
no,
I can say,
no. What I'm saying is that science can't prove the reason
yes, it
behind
can.
something.
Yes, it can. Science can do that. So I can say, Bob rolled the dice and he's a three. We're going to go ask him, hey, Bob, did you roll the dice? He's like, yeah, I rolled the dice. So if, hey, I just provided evidence of this
No, no,
third
but no,
person.
but then at the end of the day, we're looking at a context where you found the die there, and the
Yep.
person that didn't roll the die is not accessible to that particular
Well, that's
method
the
via
thing. That's the
which you're
thing.
trying to prove how it came about.
The only
Right.
time you could
Mm.
ever say someone else rolled the dice is if you had evidence of the other person. So if you could talk to the other person, if you could ask the other person, if you had a video recording of the other person, the only time it's ever rational to say a person rolled this dice is if you have evidence the other person exists. If you have no evidence the other
Mm,
person
mm, mm.
exists, it's never, ever, ever rational to say a person who I have no evidence exists rolled this dice. That's
No, but
irrational.
I think then that gets us to my initial statement where I say that there are certain observable patterns that we observe, right? That then allude to things beyond that which is observable, right? So if you can, you see like how you made an observation that within maybe the mathematics formula and even the degradation of uranium, there is certain what's it called? There are certain, I mean, quantum influx works in a particular way that's close to random, right? And then you make that allusion to how they could have possibly been a random emergent of the universe at a given point in time, right? I don't know if you're getting
Sort
where
of.
I'm coming from.
Not
Oh,
not
so
sure.
what I'm getting to is that when you observe certain patterns within the universe, or rather within observable matter or observable things, you can make assumptions or allusions to things that are not directly observable or are not directly accessible to
Yep.
the scientific method, right?
Yes.
So when you're then making the argumentation that maybe most of the things that we see here, remember initially I was making that induction argument that most of the things that we see that are very complex, that are arranged in a complex manner to perform or reach a certain goal or a certain cause, right, tend to have certain minds behind them, right? So we can't wake up one day and say maybe the computer created itself over a random process. We can scientifically show how a computer functions, right? But the functionality of the computer and its what's it called? What's it called?
Processor.
No, not necessarily the processor, and how it ends up, I think the functionality of the computer and how it ends up working in that particular way seems to suggest that there is a reason for why, seems to suggest that there is maybe a mind behind why these particular components were arranged to perform certain functionalities and also end up being the way that possibly are. So maybe when you argue that if you don't, let's say in this particular context of the dice, right? If there is no access to the person that rolled the dice, maybe if you had previous experiences that whenever you see dice, we've always seen that people roll dice, right? We've always seen there could still be an explanation that the wind blew the dice, right? But given our previous experiences or our previous observations that there is the explanation or the possibility of the explanation that people also roll dice, or there is the explanation that there is other factors that could bring about that particular outcome of an event, then we don't rule out those factors simply because we don't have um, a scientific method that gives us access to those factors, right?
Right.
It's like
Yes.
if, yeah.
But there, we
So
don't
in
have
that
any
particular
examples of
context,
that. That's the point. Is that there are no examples of where we see minds creating the universe. That's not a thing. We've never seen that. Now, you brought up the fine tuning argument, but again, that's a separate argument. So my question was, is does anything in the cosmological argument on its own, without ever referencing the teleological argument, does the cosmological argument indicate a God? And right now it seems like no. It seems like in order to indicate a God, you need the fine-tuning argument. And so the cosmological argument doesn't work. It doesn't indicate a God, because it seems what happens is you always move to the teleological argument. And you can't find anything in the cosmological argument on its own that indicates a God.
I think it indicates certain qualities of a God, right? It doesn't necessarily conclude that there is a God, right? I would propose that it concludes, or rather brings forth certain characteristics of what religious or theists would define as God, right? So when you're talking about the quality of, because at the end of the day, we've ended up with maybe two theories here. We've ended up with the possibility of the quantum influx, and we've ended up with the possibility of a God. And what do these two things have in common? These two things happen to be timeless.
Sure.
These two things happen to be spaceless. These two things happen to bring about the emergency of the universe at a particular point in time, right? Because it can't exist eternally. So these two things, what we've maybe failed to conclude is whether these two things could one thing have a mind and the other not have a mind. I mean, what we see here, the difference is that, or the distinction is that one thing could potentially have a mind and the other thing doesn't have a mind, because we believe that minds are those that have reason behind doing certain things or bringing about certain things. Because so at the end of the day, we've eradicated a whole lot of God or theodicies, or let's say ideas that maybe bring about the analogy of the supernatural, right? And what I'm arguing is that we've eradicated all those, let me call them time constrained gods. We've eradicated the matter constrained ideas of gods. We've eradicated a lot of ideas that are constrained to time, space, and matter. So now we're left with a spaceless, we're left with a timeless, we're left with at least a certain idea or an object that has these particular qualities that in part are subscribed to the idea of the Christian God.
Well, sure.
So yes,
So
it
I
has raised.
agree. I agree with all of that, but
So
none of that's actually evidence of a God, because that's just saying
but it increases. It's not necessarily evidence of a God, but it increases the probability of the conclusion being God.
no, because
It does though.
it increases the probability of it being God and it being not God equally. So it excludes a natural thing that is space, and it excludes a natural thing that is time, and it excludes a God in space and a God in time. But it excludes them both equally. But so it doesn't actually indicate God more than non-God. It indicates God and naturalism exactly the same. It doesn't differentiate. The cosmological argument can't tell the difference of whether or not God or not God created the universe. It just says something created the universe. So if I said something knocked over the cup, that's not evidence of a God, and it's not evidence of a unicorn or evidence of a leprechaun. It's just saying we have no idea what it is. That's all the cosmological argument is doing. It's saying we don't know what it is, but it's spaceless and timeless. But so that doesn't say God.
But
Nowhere
I
does
don't.
it say God.
Okay, so but I don't think it simply alludes, or rather brings us to the conclusion that anything could have created the universe,
Right,
because at
right.
the end of the
I
day,
agree. But
yes, yes.
remember
So
at the beginning I asked, what reason do we have to believe a God exists? Which means it has to be a reason that supports God more than not God. So saying that there's a certain kind of thing that created the universe is fine. I'm happy with that. But you haven't provided evidence of a God over a non-God. That's what I'm looking for. When I ask for evidence of a God, I don't want specific qualities that God might have. I want to know why, what evidence is there that supports God over non-God? And it doesn't seem like the cosmological argument does that. It seems like you admit it doesn't do that. It tries to support certain kinds of qualities that whatever created the universe must have, which I am fine with. But one of those qualities isn't consciousness. Consciousness is nowhere in those qualities. There's no God indicated in any of that. So it doesn't seem like the cosmological argument works as evidence of a God. And then you brought up the teleological argument. If you want, we can go to that one.
maybe we can maybe try dissecting, maybe going to the contingency argument before the teleological argument, because remember at the beginning, I made mention of the fact that at the end of the day, if we were to argue the probability of God over non-God, right, it's more or less a cumulative case as opposed to a one argument fits all kind of case, right? Oh, my
I
laptop's
agree
about
with
to
that, but
die.
again, there has to be one argument that indicates God more than not God. Because if all of the arguments indicate God and not God equally, then that's 0 plus 0 plus 0 plus 0 equals 0. So the cumulative case can only work if there's at least one argument that indicates God more than not God.
But then I think, sorry, my laptop is about to die. Can I catch my charger real quick? I'm just gonna bring my charger real quick. Um, okay, so let me plug it here. Okay, great. So I think what I was trying to say is that in the case of it, what's it called, raising the probability of God as opposed to, or rather in contrast to other things, or other as opposed to other explanations, right? Because at the end of the day, we both agree that it has narrowed down to what's it called. If there was, let's say, a possibility that 100 things created the universe, right? And maybe by means of that which could have possibly created the universe, rather, if you narrow down the, no, if you then create a category of that which could have possibly created the universe, as you say, that which could be maybe time, space, matter, and all that kind of stuff. So this particular thing ought to be outside of those things. We've then narrowed down the possibility to maybe from 100 to 2, right? And if we've narrowed down the explanation from 100 to 2, that increases the probability of those 2 explanations as causes or creators of that particular thing that we're trying to discuss, right? So
Sure,
when
sure,
then
but
when I
remember,
then
my question
mm,
isn't what are the things that didn't create the universe? Because I don't care. I don't. There's infinitely many things that didn't create the universe, and I don't need to know anything about any of them. I don't. I don't. Doesn't matter. A round square didn't create the universe. That's great. What I need to know is why should we think God is the better explanation than not God? So no matter what, if I eliminate round squares, that isn't evidence of God because it doesn't support God more than not God. And what I need when I ask for evidence of God is I need something that indicates God more than not God. I don't need some abstract thing that you can eliminate says, well, God is better than a round square. I don't care. I want to know why is God a better explanation than a not God?
okay. Okay, so I do understand where you're coming from, and I just wanted to put it out that, like, at the end of the day there is still like an increasing in the probability, but that's not what necessarily you're interested in. So maybe at the end of the day, if we to speak into, like I said, the cumulative case for God, then that's when we look at a lot of arguments, because I would propose that no argumentation by itself or in and of itself is proof enough for the existence of God,
Right,
right?
right. I don't need
But
proof. I just need one argument that indicates God more than not God.
okay, so now if we're maybe to look at, we can maybe go into the contingency argument, because at the end of the day, and by this I'm not suggesting that the Kalam cosmological argument does not have an explanatory power whatsoever, because at the end of the day, it would still go back to speak into all the other arguments cumulatively. But then maybe we can look into what's it called? What's your understanding of what the contingency argument is? Because I don't want us to maybe have a different understanding of what it is, and then we're both arguing across each other. So maybe what could be your understanding of the contingency argument? Or maybe since I'm the less philosophically experienced, I'll just tell you what I think it is, right?
Sure, go for it.
Great. And if maybe, and if we were to say that it is also similar to the Kalam cosmological argument, but it further argues that everything that exists has an explanation of its own existence, right? And if maybe the universe began to exist, then it ought to have the explanation of its own existence outside of itself, right? And it further assumes that things, what's it called? Things that have an explanation in and of themselves are things that tend to be necessary. So things that necessarily exist are things that tend to have an explanation of their existence in and of themselves. And of so far, our understanding is that there is only things that necessarily exist are abstract objects, right?
No,
Abstract objects
no. So,
necessarily.
so I would disagree there. I'd say that a necessary thing is we can say anything is a necessary thing. A pineapple could be a necessary thing. So I would say that the probability that God is the necessary thing is equally the same as the quantum field is the necessary thing. So I'd say that there's no reason to think that God is more likely the necessary thing than the quantum field.
Why would you say that though? So if we're
Because
to argue, could you possibly think of a world where quantum fields don't exist?
I can think of a world without quantum fields in the exact same way I can think of a world without God.
No, I think so maybe let's put it this way. Could you conceive of a world, this is logically speaking, could you conceive of a world where a triomni God doesn't exist?
Yes.
But if you're to argue that a triomni God by his or her explanation is the one that is all powerful, all knowing, God exists, and all that kind of stuff, how could you then logically come to the conclusion that a triomni God cannot exist in a particular world?
Because I can
Is that God
imagine
still triomni?
I can imagine a particular world where there's nothing.
But if how would you define a world with nothing? Because if the world at all exists, then that can't be nothing.
A world that contains no contents is a world that exists, but inside of it, it is nothing. So no God exists in this world. I could exist a world with just a pineapple. The world has a pineapple in it and nothing else. No gods.
But if you're to logically argue that this particular idea of a God that we're speaking about is a God that is all powerful, and that particular all powerful, or rather tri-omni God, then doesn't exist in the world, then that idea of a God ceases to be. It's like saying you can't come to a conclusion. If you argue that the first premise is maybe a tri-omni God exists, of course, we haven't demonstrated exclusively that he does or she does. That if we are to argue that a tri-omni God exists, right? And if we are to, for some weird reason, accept that premise that a tri-omni God exists, it logic follows that there is no possible world that a tri-omni God cannot exist.
No.
Because if a tri-omni God exists necessarily, then there is no possible world a tri-omni God cannot exist.
Well, no, again, so you can define anything as being necessary. I can define a pineapple as being necessary. It is by definition that pineapples are magically necessary. Definitionally. Can I imagine a world without pineapples? Yes. Does that prove that they're not necessary? No, it just proves I can imagine a world without pineapples. So you can imagine God has this definition of being necessary and must exist in all possible worlds. And I can imagine a world where there's literally nothing, or just a pineapple, or just the Dharma, or just a God eater that eats all gods in the universe. And so God was there, but he got eaten by the God eater. So in philosophy, the possible worlds argument doesn't work because you can literally imagine worlds that are just have one thing in them: a brick, a pineapple, potato.
But does that not but don't you think that then creates a contradiction in of itself? If you were to argue that this particular thing is necessary, this particular thing necessarily exists, and then you still argue that then you can conceive of the world where that which you classified as a necessarily existing being doesn't exist, does that then not contradict the necessity of this particular thing?
No, it doesn't, because you can imagine a set of worlds in which all of the worlds contains an object, and then you can imagine a different set of worlds that don't. So, for example, I can say, I imagine that there is a necessary pineapple. All possible worlds has a pineapple in it. Then I can say, okay, I imagine a world where pineapples are not necessary, and they're not in every possible world. So I can imagine both cases, and they could both be true or both be false, like independently, like not at the same time. And so I can imagine the thing has the property of being necessary, but be wrong. So I can imagine God is necessary and to be wrong, in which case he doesn't exist. So you can simply give the definition. You can say he's necessary, but be wrong.
Okay, so the argumentation is no longer about whether whether they exist in all possible worlds. It's more about whether they be necessary or not. Because at a point in time where they don't exist in a particular possible world, then they cease to be necessary. Is that what you're arguing?
Sort of, yes. So necessary is essentially an arbitrary label that we can apply to anything. We can just say it's necessary, and we can all be wrong. A potato is necessary. Like, clearly that's probably not correct. Probably wrong that potatoes are necessary. But we can say the words. We can have the idea of a potato that it is impossible to imagine a universe without a potato. But what we imagine is irrelevant. It's literally irrelevant what we can or can't imagine. It tells us nothing about reality. So maybe we can imagine an alien species that imprints in all of our brains and makes it impossible for any human being to imagine a universe without a potato. Does that make potatoes necessary? No, it doesn't. No, So the fact that we can define it as necessary, or that our brains define it as necessary, tells us nothing about reality. So the fact that you claim God is necessary is no different from me claiming a potato is necessary. There's no evidence to support that. It's just an assertion.
But I don't think it necessarily is, because at the point where you claim that a potato is possibly necessary, you still haven't what's it called? You still haven't taken into account the other character traits that could be ascribed to the potato. So if you then speak about a potato that is necessary but still bound to the laws of physics of decay, then that potato ceases to hold those character traits that would potentially subscribe to a god, right?
No.
Because at the end of the day, remember, at the end of the day, if you're to say that a potato exists, right? Remember, as we're arguing the necessity of this particular being, right? We're also in turn or cumulatively arguing that this potential being, while they be necessary, they timeless, right? They spaceless, right? They matterless, right? And matterless, I don't mean matter in that sense, but matter in the scientific sense. They matter,
Well,
right?
no, like
And
necessary being could be in space, in time, and made of matter. So it can be all of those things.
remember, okay, so you remember what I said is that at the end of the day, there is a cumulative case that we're
Right.
making here. So
Yes.
if we were to come from the Kalam cosmological argument, which has set a precedent that this particular thing that brought forth the universe to exist ought to be spaceless, timeless, matterless, and all that kind of stuff, then we further then maybe call upon another argumentation to come and help us with our understanding of this particular thing that is spaceless, timeless, matterless, what, is it, could it possibly be necessary,
Well,
right?
right.
This
I
argumentation,
just want to clarify. So
okay,
a necessary thing doesn't need to be what created the universe. Like, for example, a necessary thing could be a potato, matter, time, and those could be necessary things. They exist in all possible worlds. And so you could say a necessary thing is a material thing, just fine. You don't need the only kind of necessary thing to be the kind that created our universe. There could be other kinds of necessary things.
that's not what I'm arguing. That's not what
Thank
I'm
you for the
arguing.
super chat, Richard.
What I'm
Appreciate it.
arguing is what I'm arguing is the cumulative case.
Wait.
What's it called?
I just want to clarify. So I'm saying that these two arguments aren't connected. They don't add anything to one another. Like you can say
No.
a potato is a necessary thing. Potatoes did not create the universe. Potatoes are still a necessary thing. So I can say that there's a potato inside of the only thing that exists in this universe is just a potato. It did not create a universe, but it's still a necessary thing. Now, if that's possible, if you can have a potato that's a necessary thing that didn't create the universe, what did create our universe is irrelevant. It doesn't matter because the potato is in the universe without, or in the world without a universe. So it doesn't matter whether or not the potato created the universe because the potato exists. It is a necessary thing independent of whether our universe is created.
You see, true. Just like we would say, just like numbers do exist necessarily, because in and of themselves, they maybe like we could argue that numbers also do exist necessarily, but we can't logically conceive of a world where numbers bring forth a universe. Because at the end of the day, we are not arguing necessity by virtue of the definition of what a necessary being ought to be. We're arguing that this particular necessary being brought forth the universe. So if you then if you are to include the premise that what's it called, this particular subject, which is the universe, has an explanation in and of itself in a necessary being, we can't. This eliminates a lot of other speculations that you can argue, because you can't then argue a potato is what's it called, the explanation of the universe, if the potato in and of itself is part of the universe. You can't argue that it's an apple because an apple is part of the universe in and of itself. So maybe what we're suggesting, or what my proposal is, that that which we are attributing the character trait of necessity, right, ought to be that which exists out of the universe. I mean, not we're attributing a certain thing, we're calling it necessary, right? And this particular thing, at the same time, we're also suggesting that this thing is within which we find the explanation of the universe.
I think I'm following, but I think you missed what my objection was. So my objection with the potato is saying there is no such thing as a necessary being that exists in all possible worlds. It doesn't exist. It is a pure figment of human imagination that is false. So I can imagine a world with a potato that's a necessary being, and I can imagine a world with a God that's a necessary being, and those contradict. So if I have two different kinds of necessary beings that exist in all possible worlds, and they're both equally omnipotent, Well, they can't both exist in the same world, so I now have a contradiction. So my argument here is that the idea of a necessary being is false, because we can prove that there isn't such a thing, since I can have two contradictory kinds of necessary beings. So if I can undermine the idea of a necessary being as you have defined it, then the whole argument fails. You can't use it as a cumulative case.
I think, because remember we had like what's it called? What we'd call two definitions of necessity, if I may say, right? And necessity, that being that which has an explanation in and of itself, right?
Right.
That which finds an explanation in of itself, and that which exists in all possible worlds, right? You can argue that there is potentially, you can imagine or conceive of a world where apples are necessary stuff, right? But that doesn't necessarily follow that apples have the existence, or rather the explanation of the existence in and of themselves, right? So what I'm arguing is that there is this particular necessary being, and it's necessary by virtue of the fact that it has the explanation of its own, the explanation of its existence in and of itself.
Right. So I agree with what you said before, where you said, if I said an apple is necessary, and by definition, that means it has an explanation in and of itself. And you said, well, you could just be wrong. Apples just don't. Like, yes, exactly. So just like you say, God is necessary and has an explanation in and of himself, I could just be like, no, you're wrong. God is like apples. Neither of them do. So the fact that you assert something is a necessary being isn't evidence. You could just be wrong, just like apples. Saying apples is a necessary thing, well, you're just wrong. So if you say God is a necessary thing, you could just be wrong. So there's no evidence that either of these things are necessary. You're just asserting them. So the evidence that God is a necessary thing, the triomni God is a necessary thing, is exactly the same as the evidence that an apple is a necessary thing. The only evidence is that you've asserted it. That's it. And so the fact that the only evidence that exists is that you've asserted it means that they're on equal footing. God and apples have equal credibility of being the necessary thing, which is zero. They have zero credibility of being necessary things. They're just asserted.
But you see, at the end of the day, I like using the statement at the end of the day. So what we're drawing at is that if we're to, because we made the assertion initially that not one argument, what's it called, would exclusively annihilate the possibility of there not being a God, right? Or there being a God in and of itself, right? But what we're stating is that if you're to have a case for contingency, it's an argument from contingency, right? And you say that we're assuming that this particular God, in whom the explanation of their own existence is within themselves, then we can then look into other argumentations that try to understand or try to narrow down what the character traits of this particular idea of a God actually could have.
Right. I
So
agree
now
with that, but what I'm saying is that
yes.
your argument doesn't do that. The contingency argument does not do that. Or it is the contingency argument doesn't do that. It tells us nothing. It tells us absolutely nothing. It's an exact big zero with nothing, because there's no evidence of a necessary being having these properties. You're just making it up. I can make up and say an apple has a necessary property. Does that mean that that's evidence that apples created the universe? No. It doesn't matter if I add in the cosmological argument. It's completely irrelevant. So if I can show that the entire contingency argument fails and it indicates nothing because necessary qualities are just made up by human minds, then the entire argument is a big fat zero, and it doesn't matter what else. You can add anything else you want to it. Zero times anything is zero. And so my argument here is that it doesn't matter what you add into the contingency argument. I can just show it's a zero. If I can show it's a zero, there's nothing you can possibly add to it to make it not zero. And so because there's no evidence that necessary qualities are real things and not just made up by human imagination, then it's a zero. And you can't add anything to it to change that. It's still going to be a zero.
Okay, so I think if I'm to get what you're trying to say, so you're simply arguing that there's no such things as necessary objects or necessary things within the universe.
Yes. As you have defined it.
Okay,
I think your definition of necessary is false.
Okay, so what would you define as what's your definition of a necessary thing, or what could potentially be a necessary thing, and what are some of the examples of necessary things
I would say
you would potentially give?
Yeah, I'd say the foundation of any world is a necessary thing.
What does that mean?
whatever is the fundamental thing that created all other things in a world is the necessary thing. So it could be a quantum field, it could be a god, it could be a magical pixie. Anything that created everything else in the universe is a necessary thing. So if it wasn't created, so if a non-created thing that created everything else in a particular world.
Okay, so does that then mean that what's it called? I think it takes us back to the point that I was making initially, right? If we were to maybe define, let's stick to that definition. If we were to define that anything that set everything in motion or anything that created everything ought to be a necessary being by that definition, then we ought to understand why is this particular necessary being, what's it called? Either God over the quantum field, or why is it the quantum field over God, right?
Yep.
So at the end of the day, we've argued that this particular thing that set everything in motion is a necessary being, right?
Sure.
And then we still are left with the possibility of this particular thing either being a god or a non-god, or
Right.
let's, for this particular case, being the quantum field or the God hypothesis,
Yep.
right? So at the end of the day, now we've attributed another quality to this particular probabilities, the two probabilities that we have.
Which
So
is
now
still
we're
zero.
arguing.
Still zero evidence.
No, we see. No, we're coming there. We're coming there. So at the end of the day, we've ruled out all other things that are not necessary. In this particular context, if you add the contingency argument to the Kalam cosmological argument, we've excluded all things that are not necessary. We've excluded all the things. Sorry, I got a message here. We've excluded all the things that are not necessary. We've excluded all of the things that the Kalam cosmological argument excludes from what it defines as the beginning of the universe, right? Now, then maybe we can proceed to the fine-tuning argument.
Well, again,
right?
the point here is that none of that matters. Like we can exclude lots of things. That's not evidence. Excluding things is not evidence. It's completely a waste of time. Like all of that excluding is irrelevant. Like I can exclude round squares. Round squares didn't create the universe. Have I added any evidence to any hypothesis? No. It's still zero.
No, but I think if you're to look at what's called the probability, if you're to look at it from the probability perspective,
probability is still zero. It's still zero.
The more things, the more things you eliminate,
it's still
the higher the probability of that which is left.
No, still zero. So like if I have, like, let's say what knocked the cup over and I say, well, it wasn't the unicorns. Does that add probability that it was leprechauns? No, it's still zero. Does it add probability?
Potentially.
No.
I think that's where I think that's where we'll disagree, right? That's where we'll disagree. We'll disagree that if there was like 5 explanations of why something could possibly happen, and via means of evidence, we eradicated one of the 5, that is going to increase the probability that it was 4. No. Because at the end of the day, the 5th possibility has been eliminated, and that leaves, if there's probability of 100%, that if let's say each of the 5 explanations has 25% chance that it brought about that particular outcome.
Well, that's
if we eliminate one,
begging the question. So imagine there are 10 axles for car axles. Let's say we discover the first 9 axles are broken. Does that increase the probability that the 10th axle works?
More or less, if you haven't explored it. No, if you haven't explored it, the probability that it is the explanation of that is higher than those that you've already eradicated or eliminated.
No.
But it has, though.
It's like if I said, let's say we have a jar and we're picking marbles out of the jar, and the first 5 marbles, we know there's 10 marbles. There's 10 marbles in the jar, and the first 5 are all red. And the 6th one is red, and the 7th one is red, and the 8th one is red. What is the probability that the 9th and 10th one are not red?
Higher than when there were 10 marbles.
No.
But that's the thing. The thing. Let's assume. No. Let's assume there is 2 worlds, right?
That's a gambler's fallacy. This is a gambler's fallacy. So like,
okay,
I just want to explain this for a minute. Let's go back.
Let's look at it this way. Let's look at it.
I just want to explain this a little bit. So if we have 10 car axles, there's 10 car axles, and we discover the first one's broken, and the second one's broken, and the third one's broken, and the 4th one's broken. This tells us nothing about the 5th one, the 6th one. They could also be broken. It's not more likely that they're not broken. They could all be broken. All of them, all 10 are broken. So the fact that the first 9 are broken.
But at the end of what the premise that we started, if the premise that we started with is that one of these things is gonna be the explanation of the beginning of something.
Right. That's the begging the question.
No. Wait. Let's say if you had to look at the marbles example, right? There's 10 marbles in a jar, and so far we've collected 5 red marbles. Our first premise was that one of these marbles is yellow.
Right, that's begging
right?
the
That was
question.
our
You
first
can't
premise,
do that.
right?
You can't do that.
No,
That's
no, but
begging the question.
so
We could
but at
both
the
be
end of the day,
wrong. Both of our hypotheses could be wrong. So you can't say because we've eliminated round squares that it's evidence that one of ours is more likely to be right. We could just all be wrong. We could all just have broken axles. Thank you for the super chat, Charles. Appreciate it. So this is why the methodology you're using is fundamentally flawed here, is because you're saying one of the things we imagine must be correct. And so if we eliminate some of the things we imagine, then that increases the probability of the other things we imagine. No, it doesn't. It adds exactly nothing. It adds exactly zero evidence to any of the hypotheses. In order to have evidence of a hypothesis, you must have positive evidence of that hypothesis. Negative evidence of other hypotheses is never positive evidence of yours, ever, under any circumstances. So if I say, this phone did not create the universe, does that mean that's evidence of this cup? No. Still zero. In order to be evidence of this cup hypothesis must make predictions of some kind. So like simply eliminating other things is never evidence.
But holistically, what we're suggesting, even in the context where we're both wrong, it still holistically increases the probability that that accurate explanation for that particular cause is more, like the probability of that is actually increased. Because at the end of the day, we're looking at a world or a context within which, let me say, if there was such a thing as a fear of everything, all right? If there was a container where there was every particular possible explanation of this particular outcome, and one of the possibilities of, or rather one of the explanations within this container is accurate, right? The more explanations that you get rid of, the higher the chances that that particular explanation that exists, or rather that particular explanations or those explanations that are left behind, they had the possibility of them being more accurate. Because at the end of the day, maybe you're starting with a jar. I feel like if we have to look at this jar of marbles, we're looking at a jar of possible explanations for what we believe to be the universe, right? And we are then assuming, in as much as maybe our thought process or our understanding of whether they be a yellow marble in this jar is limited to only the 5 red marbles, right?
Well, that's the problem. That's the begging the question you can't do. So my whole objection here is that your entire methodology fails because you're begging the question. You can't ever assume that you have the right answer. It's just not an option. You can never get evidence by eliminating other things. You can't do it. You need a positive reason for your claim. Don't ever waste time eliminating other things. I don't care. Give positive reasons of your claim. If I want evidence of general relativity, I say we can observe this curvature of space-time in gravitational waves. I don't need to eliminate other things. I don't have to waste any time eliminating other things. It's a complete waste of time. I can give one example of positive evidence for my claim, and you don't seem to be able to do that. So anytime you are eliminating other things, it's a zero. It's a waste of time, not evidence. I can just say that's not evidence. Give me some evidence.
But I think at the end of the day, at the end of the day, we're arguing concepts that are inaccessible via the methods that we currently have now, right? So the
the quantum mechanics is we can demonstrate quantum mechanics. That's accessible. We can test it.
Mm-hmm. But that doesn't exclusively prove that the quantum mechanics is the explanation for the beginning of the universe, is but a possibility of the explanation of the universe.
Well,
right?
It's evidence. So it's evidence that this is right and everything else is wrong. So the fact that the quantum fields can make testable predictions and have been confirmed, that's evidence, that positive evidence that one's right and everything else is wrong. God is wrong, leprechauns are wrong, fairies is wrong. Because it can make predictions, that's a piece of positive evidence that moves the probability that it's true up and everything else down. So
no, but I think because we at the end of the day aren't. I think what we fail to distinguish is where the distinction of our position actually is, right?
Because I understand your argument. Your argument is that even if the quantum fields have been demonstrated to be correct, well, that could be explained by God, but that doesn't matter. It's like if I say we're going to demonstrate that the wind knocked over the cup and nothing else exists, no leprechauns exist. The model is the wind did it and nothing else did it. And that model makes predictions and is shown to be correct. That's evidence of that model, and everything else gets no evidence. Everything else is a zero. Everything else is wrong. Everything else is off the table. So the fact that one model makes predictions and none of the others do, that one gets 100% of the evidence. Nothing else does. So the fact that you can add other things in is just not evidence. So the fact that the quantum fields make the predictions, it gets all the evidence. It has everything. There's no other theories that have any evidence. It's only the quantum fields. And adding in that, well, these could be explained by something else is never going to be evidence. It's just adding stuff to the hypothesis that's unnecessary.
Okay, so what are you necessarily arguing that the only forms of evidence that are relevant to the pursuit of knowledge is scientific evidence?
No. Thank you for the super chat, Dima Music. So I'm saying evidence is anything that can differentiate imagination from reality. That's what evidence is.
Okay.
And novel testable predictions do that really well. Science works as a very good way to do that. If you have a different way to do it, that's fine too. I don't really care what the method is, but it has to be able to differentiate imagination from reality to count as evidence. And what you presented doesn't. It's just you're saying even if I eliminate a billion other possibilities, that'll never be evidence of mine. So like if I go present a scientific paper, I say the cause of, let's say, fire is phlogiston, and I say I eliminate things. It's not hydrogen, it's not nitrogen, it's not helium, it's not plutonium or uranium. No scientist is ever going to take me seriously. They're not going to be like, oh, you've eliminated enough things that we grant you're right. Never going to happen. You have to provide positive evidence of your case. Negative evidence of other people's theories is literally never going to be evidence that your theory is right.
That's true. That's true. I do actually agree with that. I do agree with that statement. And I'm still what they called proposing that if maybe remember in this particular context we are faced with a scenario where we don't have this scientific capacity to examine that which could have either brought forth or couldn't have brought forth this particular material world that we're looking
at. I'm not sure what you mean by that, because we literally do.
This, what I'm talking about is that even because if given that maybe by the scientific method, the quantum field, or as you've speculated, the quantum field brought forth the universe, that doesn't eliminate, or rather that doesn't conclude that there is or there is no God.
Yes, it does. Right? So it literally says this is the theory that's right. Yes, it does. So in a scientific theory, you make a theory, this is caused by quantum mechanics. It's not caused by God. And if this one makes testable predictions, it's evidence of the quantum mechanics and against God. It disproves God. If we have a theory that can explain it, that says there's no God, it's the quantum field, and that one gets the things right, that's evidence there's no God.
That's where I beg to differ. Giving an explanation of something doesn't eliminate what's it called? Let me put it this way: giving giving us a manuscript of how the Ford was put together doesn't eliminate the first idea or the first creator of the Ford car as we can currently see it. Yes, you have a very good explanation, or you have a very good, possibly scientific explanation of how to put Ford parts together and how they then function the way they do function, but you haven't by that explanation eradicated the guy that created the Ford car, right? Or the guy that came up with the idea that the Ford car ought to be designed this particular way. So you've explained the design, but by means of explaining the design, you haven't eradicated the designer, so to speak.
So
so we still have.
Does proving lightning is caused by friction in clouds disprove Thor?
Not necessarily.
Right. But which one has more evidence?
I mean, the lightning has more evidence because going back to the
lightning is the phenomenon. So the question is
no, lightning is the phenomenon. Thor is maybe, let's say, the god of the phenomenon, right? So not necessarily caused, right? Not necessarily. See now, where I want us to have the distinction is that instead of looking at it as a chain reaction where Thor causes lightning, right, and contrasting it with maybe the charges, positive charges causing the lightning, right? We are arguing that Thor is actually the god of this particular phenomenon that causes the lightning, right? So we are suggesting that there is the phenomenon that we can explain that brings about lightning, positive charges interacting, right? And we are also then concurrently arguing that Thor is the god of this particular phenomenon, What
Right,
does
right,
that
right.
mean?
So if
Thor,
somebody thought that Thor literally produced the lightning, they would be wrong, right?
definitely,
Right, right.
definitely.
And
So they
so
would be wrong. But
if
the
they thought
idea
that
here,
Thor produced the friction in the clouds, they would be wrong, right?
no. The idea is that
No, I
Thor
understand.
set in motion.
I
Yeah,
understand
yeah,
what
yeah.
you're trying to say. Follow my argument here. So, if
Okay.
someone was like, someone believed that lightning was caused by Thor, they would be wrong, right?
In part.
So literally, I'm talking literally the Roman God. We don't believe in like. I'm assuming you're not a
I
polytheist,
understand. I
right?
understand. No, I'm not. I'm not
Right.
polytheist.
We have two hypotheses. The
Yeah.
scientist says lightning is caused by friction in the clouds. The Thor believer says Thor did it. Now, the scientist said if it's
Let's
caused by friction in the
let's create a third set of people, because
okay.
I feel like you're restricting it to some Thor believers believing Thor by some magical words made the lightning happen, and also there's the scientific method of how lightning actually works, is rather restricting the analogy. Let's create a third analogy whereby Thor is the reason why lightning behaves the way it does. If you're to then explain how lightning works, you still haven't eliminated why maybe it behaves that particular way and not the other way.
Okay, so the
So
question
the
here
argumentation is that Thor is the
is there
reason.
anybody who is rational today in believing that Thor causes lightning? Is that a rational belief?
No,
Why?
because we've eliminated. We're going back to the what's it
We
called?
haven't eliminated it. We have
Maybe
never disproven
no. We're
Thor.
going back to the. Remember, we're going back to the whole understanding of us eradicating
No,
the
you
possibility
can
of
never
other
eradicate.
explanations.
In science you can
No, no,
never
no, no.
ever eradicate anything. It's impossible to ever eradicate. You can never prove anything false. We've never proven Thor doesn't exist. It is
But
impossible.
isn't the black backbone of the scientific method falsification?
No. Falsification was disproven. It's one of the methods we try to use under very specific circumstances. So you can falsify something if you say, my theory is right only if we see this result at exactly this time, and if we don't see it, then my theory is wrong. That's the only way to falsify a theory. But you can never falsify something if you just change it a little bit. So you can say, oh, well, it wasn't feeling correct today. Then you've not falsified it. So it is literally impossible to falsify anything in science unless you provided a very specific hypothesis. So no, you can never falsify something. Like we haven't falsified the flat Earth. Maybe we're in the Matrix. You've seen the movie The Matrix?
Yeah, I have.
So we could be in the Matrix and the world is actually flat. So we haven't falsified that the world is flat. Just all of the evidence indicates the world is round. So we have positive evidence the world is round, and we've never falsified the world is flat, but we still reject it. Thank you. So this is the same thing with any kind of a God hypothesis or any hypothesis. You never falsify the alternatives. It's a complete waste of time. We could always be in the Matrix, and there could always just be another way we just haven't tested yet. But what evidence is positive indications that it is round. That is good evidence. We'll never falsify that the world is not flat. We'll never prove we're not in the Matrix. We can't do it. But the fact that we can never falsify that doesn't mean it's evidence that it's the case. It doesn't mean it's rational to believe the world is flat, because all of the evidence indicates it's round. Now you could say, well, all that evidence can be explained by the fact that we're in the Matrix and the Matrix designers wanted it to look round, but really outside of the Matrix, the world is completely flat. But is that evidence the world is flat? No. The fact that we haven't falsified it is not evidence for it. What is evidence is the fact that we observe and make testable predictions that if it's round, here's the things we can do to experiment and see that it is in fact round. So simply saying we haven't falsified that the world is flat is not evidence that the world is flat. We can still say, nope, they're wrong. Anybody who believes the world is flat is wrong. We don't need to falsify that. We just have to have positive evidence that it's round.
Okay, so I think because the question was, of course, in the world that we currently live in, nobody believes that there exists a Thor, right? But my argument was that even in this hypothetical that we're trying to assess, is that whether you can very well explain how lightning works, right? That doesn't eliminate that Thor could have created the phenomenon via which lightning works. right?
Right. So let's go back to the flat Earth example. If we say all of
Okay,
the evidence the world is round, does that eliminate the possibility the world is flat?
not necessarily.
Right. You don't need to. So it's even if it doesn't eliminate the possibility, we can still say anybody who believes the world is flat is crazy, right?
But then the probability of it being round is more onto the side of, I mean, the probability of the correct answer is in favor of it being round than it being flat. There is a
Yes.
possibility that it is this, right?
Yes.
And but the probability is increased onto that particular mechanism, right? But at the end of the day, the explanation of the Earth being round wasn't embedded in the Earth being flat. Because at the end of the day, I think we're not using a fair analogy. If we are to compare that particular analogy of the explanation of an outcome, right, rather the explanation as opposed to the reason behind an outcome, and then we use the flat Earth, round Earth explanation or example, I don't think that's a fair analysis of the presentation that I'm trying to make. I think the
Well, I'm not.
presentation is that.
Well, I think it is because I think that when we say if somebody thinks the world is flat and then we discover we like go to space and see nope it's round and then they can say well that doesn't prove it's round because really it's just an illusion, we're in the matrix, and so if we go outside the matrix we'll discover it's flat. They can always make up an amended ad hoc way to make their theory fit the evidence. You can always explain all of the evidence by adding on an ad hoc amendum to make it fit, by like saying we're in the matrix therefore the world is actually flat. And that seems to be the same thing as when you're adding in well maybe there was maybe some being had a reason to make quantum mechanics do this or whatever. That's exactly the same thing as the flat earther who says well maybe we're in the matrix so maybe it's really flat. Now in the same way that our evidence that the world is round eliminates the flat earth model because it doesn't prove it false. Like maybe we're in the matrix, we can't prove that false, but all of the positive evidence the world is round is a good reason to reject that hypothesis. In the
But
exact
now
same
you
way,
see,
the
okay,
positive evidence we have of quantum fields is a good reason to reject the God hypothesis. That's why most physicists are
but I think
atheists.
that's where I think there is the unfair analysis, right? In this particular example that you gave, the evidence that we have is rather eliminating of a flat Earth, not the matrix ideology, right? If remember,
Say
if
that
the
again.
reason of us perceiving, if the reason of us perceiving the Earth as round is because there is a certain matrix that makes us perceive of it as that way, right? In this particular matrix, all the evidence that we have access to is that the Earth is round. So it
Yes.
definitely is going to disprove a flat Earth, but it's not going to disprove the existence of a matrix, right? So now I'm then trying to um, explain that at the end of the day, the reason behind that which we perceive isn't eradicated by the explanation of that which we are perceiving, right? So you're explaining that maybe our perception of the earth being round, of course, it definitely will eliminate the earth being flat because those two theories are counter with each other, or rather they set up against each other. We have the possibility of a flat earth and the possibility of a non-flat earth, right? One of them is not the explanation of the other, right? One of them is not the reason of the other. They're simply counter theories that have been set apart against each other, right? And then these particular theories, one of them has evidence that supports it over the other. Then we say that the probability of the other theory is higher than that. But if we are to argue that the matrix is the reason why we're perceiving of a round Earth, the fact that you see that the Earth is round and you have evidence of the Earth being round doesn't eradicate the matrix theory. That's what I'm trying to draw.
Right. It doesn't eliminate the matrix theory, but it's still ridiculous to believe in the matrix. Like anybody who believes in the matrix is ridiculous. So the point here is that
But then on what basis would you then say that? Because now, I mean, when you say that, of course, I could agree with you because I wouldn't I wouldn't maybe want a world where everything is a matrix and I'm just like a computer, whatever the case may be, right? But on the basis that you then come to the understanding, or rather you come to distinguish whether the world is a matrix or not, it's not the same basis that you come to distinguish whether the earth be round or flat, right? At this lower level, you're arguing the earth is not flat because we have evidence of it being round. But the evidence of the earth being round doesn't eliminate the evidence of this being a matrix, right? Those are
Right.
two different theories.
Right.
If for some
We
reason,
have
if for
lots
some
of evidence the world is round. We have no evidence we're in the matrix. So it's rational to believe the world is round and that we're not in the matrix. So if no evidence has been provided that we are in the matrix, then you can say there is nothing that supports that hypothesis. We can therefore reject it. Where we have lots of evidence the world is round, so we have lots of good reason to accept that hypothesis. So likewise, if we have lots of reason to accept the hypothesis the universe was created by quantum fields, and there's no evidence a God was there, then we can reject the God hypothesis. That is false. There is no God. There is no matrix because there's no evidence that has been presented for those things. And we can accept the hypotheses that do have evidence that the world is round, that the quantum fields created the universe, because both of those things have evidence. So until evidence is provided for the God or the matrix, then we can say we can reject them and say they are false. They are imaginary. They are things in people's imagination and are not real. So we don't need to prove those things false. We just need to say, if you haven't provided evidence of those things, then it's rational to think they are false.
I, th- I think maybe that's where I would need to, what's it called, give further thought and analysis on that. But I wouldn't necessarily say that that then drives us to believe that maybe the matrix or the God hypothesis is false because we have evidence of how the matrix or the world works, right?
Well, right.
If
That's
you're to
what I said is that we can conclude they're false is because no evidence has been provided for them. So like everything starts as imaginary. It's an imagination thing, something somebody came up with in their imagination. And then in order to be reasonable to believe it exists outside of people's imagination, you need evidence. Remember I said evidence is that which can differentiate imagination from reality. So we have a reason to believe that the world is round. That evidence has been provided to show that that is true, independent of our imagination. There is no evidence that has been provided to show that the world is flat, is true, independent of our imagination. Therefore, we're reasonable to accept the world is round and reject the world is flat because evidence has been provided for the world being round and no evidence has been provided for the world being flat. The world being round doesn't disprove that we're in the matrix. It doesn't disprove that the world is flat. But there's positive evidence to accept that that statement, the world is round, is true, independent of our imagination. And no positive evidence exists to accept the statement the world is flat is true, independent of our imagination. And the same thing would apply here to God and quantum fields. We have good reason to believe
so at the end of the day,
go ahead.
So we've now ended up with the concept of, yeah, because I'm sorry, I'll be maybe we'll conclude in the discussion in the next 5 minutes because I had so much to go. But anyways, what we've ended up with is that we've come to the understanding that there is an explanation for how the world behaves, just like there is an explanation for how lightning behaves, right? We haven't then come to the conclusion. I think it won't be genuine for us to then draw the conclusion, maybe looking at the lightning hypothesis, right? We can't draw the conclusion that because we understand how lightning works, this therefore eliminates the reason or there being no reason that Thor created it in this particular way or said it in this particular way, right? We are left with the analysis that we understand how lightning works. We understand how the Ford car works. We understand how water in a kettle boils. We understand all of these things, right? And we simply have no evidence for the reason behind why these things behave the way they do. Because I was initially suggesting that there is no scientific evidence to measure reason, right? There is no scientific method that you can put in place to measure reason, right? The best thing you can do is maybe draw from the previous or past observations that the reasons that have been behind these particular events occurring have been this. So therefore, this particular event occurring possibly has a reason behind its occurrence, right? But there is no direct scientific method that you can maybe put reason in a test tube and say, I titrated 30 milliliters of reason for why this particular thing is the way it is, right? So at the end of the day, from your perspective, you're arguing that maybe we ought to, what's it called? I think from what I understand from the atheism understanding of things is that there is no God behind all of this thing that's functioning. And the theist is arguing that there is a God. So both statements are more like statements of assertions, right? They both worldviews are asserting that they be or they be no God, right? And both sides are appealing to the naturalistic explanation of that to then suggest whether their side is much more favorable than the other side, right? And what we still end up with is there is an explanation for how things behave, but this explanation hasn't eradicated the possibility of that reason behind those things or there being no reason behind those things. So maybe the scientist would have to prove that all these things that are occurring, I mean, the atheist would have to prove that all these things that are occurring are consistently from the beginning to the end occurring randomly, and there is no some sort of mind behind it. And then they maybe the theist would have to prove that there is a mind behind all of these things, and that's why they're behaving the way they're behaving. But at this stage of the conversation, it seems as though both aisles of the analysis don't necessarily favor the other. We only end up with this explains how this works, but we aren't what's it called? We aren't coming to the conclusion that the explanation of this particular phenomenon is speaking more into things happening at random as opposed to things being set in motion to work that particular way.
Right, and to summarize my view is that to me it seems like you're like the flat earther who's saying, well, I mean, the fact that science shows the world is round, well, it doesn't have any way to measure the matrix. Science can't measure the matrix. It can't like measure 3 ounces of matrix to understand how it's looking, and really they just understand how the matrix is working. And so actually the world is flat outside of the matrix, and science can't measure the matrix, and therefore it's reasonable to believe the world is flat. And my position is like, no, that's completely irrational because there's no positive evidence of the matrix. There is positive evidence the world is round. It may not be able to differentiate whether or not we're in the matrix, but there's no positive evidence of the matrix. So we're rational to believe in the positive evidence the world is round and irrational to believe in the matrix. And so I'd say the same is the case with God. We're rational to believe in quantum fields. It's irrational to believe that God caused the quantum fields, just like it's irrational to believe that a matrix caused the evidence that the world is round. But yeah, if you said you have to go, do you want to give a shout out to where people can find your channel?
This has been very, very fruitful conversations, and the basis of my channel is actually to have more of these conversations. And I made a disclaimer, I'm pretty new to all these concepts of philosophy and whatnot. So thanks to Tom for actually opening up my mind to a lot of perspectives that I could have only experienced or come across on this particular day. And that also puts me in a place where there is need for further analysis of my position and further analysis of the evidence that probably does exist for my point of view and worldview. So thanks to Tom Jump's viewers and all the people that have contributed to the existence of this channel. You can actually find me on Roundtable Apologetics. It's a very, very tiny channel that just actually started recently. And I hope that in the due course of the progression of my channel, you can see how I intellectually grow in the way I attempt to have these discourses that I'm having with the people like Tom and other people that I'll encounter. So thank you so much, Tom, for this opportunity. I love having these conversations, and you've actually broadened my mind because it was limited to a certain level of conversation and discourse, and it now causes me to improve on the way I approach this topic and how I understand all of these things, as I would call reality. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate you coming on. It was a real joy to talk with you. You're a lot better than a lot of the theists. So even though you've just started off, you're doing really, really well. And I want to congratulate you on your argumentation style. You're very intelligent in the way that you come across those arguments. And so keep going, and I think you'll do great.